Welcome to the Institute for Government. I'm Jill Rutter. I'm Programme Director for Brexit, but much more importantly, today I am chairing this top conversation. We did have the boring hashtag of hashtag IFG politics. We've, with the agreement of Marie LeConte, our author tonight, who is going to tell us about Westminster gossip, decided that's far too dull. So we have changed it to hashtag IFG gossip. So please join the gossip online. And we're going to hear from Marie and our fantastic panel about her book. I'm plugging the book. Haven't you heard? Which is described by Emily Thornberry, no less, as not just eye-opening, but eye-popping, and frequently laugh out loud funny. So I'm raising expectations, raising that bar. An essential read for anyone considering a career in politics, and a rollicking good fun for those of us already here. So that's pretty much a recommendation. So we're going to set off with Marie LeConte is going to tell us what's in her book, for those of us that haven't read it all yet. Then we are going to have some thoughts from some of the people who are some of the characters that really sort of populate the bubble about which Marie is writing. So on my immediate left, we have Matthew O'Toole. Matt was a former civil servant in Number 10 and the Treasury, and it says he's a journalist, but I think he's a PR guy.
A mix of both. Like lots of people, I'm a PR guy who occasionally does journalism.
Yeah, okay. Okay. And then we have Tara O'Reilly. Tara is founder of Women in Westminster and coordinator for the Labour Tribune MPs Group. And then you may not realise that the person on my far right is not Lord Wood of Anfield. Lord Wood of Anfield is unfortunately detained doing some of the other things that are going on in Westminster tonight, notably voting on the Ben bill in the House of Lords on a running 3-line whip, and therefore very much regrets that he's not been let off for tonight. Don't know what the whips are thinking of. But anyway, the bill is going to pass anyway, Stuart, or whatever. Going to be very weird. Anyway, so we're going to hear from them. Just to introduce Marie, she's a political journalist, freelance. She writes for publications including Prospect Magazine, Guardian, GQ, and the New Statesman. She's appeared on Any Questions, the Today programme, Newsnight, and many others. So without further ado, Marie, what's in your book?
Oh, hi. So I've made absolutely no notes for this because every time I try to sit down and say, okay, think about what I'm going to say, something happened or someone resigned. And then I had to spend 30 minutes on Twitter making jokes. Obviously, I had to. So I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to say. And also, having watched Boris Johnson's speech earlier, I'm no longer full of confidence that I can just wing a speech without notes. But yes, no, I guess... So yeah, I've written a book which is completely absurd and weird, but I guess I have. So I guess it kind of started by, so I kind of joined Westminster as a political diarist at the time in 2015, and like I think a lot of people who joined Westminster already kind of was a massive political nerd, and so I sort of arrived and thought, I know what to expect, I know how Westminster works, I know, kind of how everything works, how my job works, etc. And then kind of arriving and making contact with people, making friends with the bubble, etc., and starting to do that job, I was like, actually, I had no idea how Westminster really works. I had no idea how, how much, for example, personal relationships matter, how much actually gossip flows both ways as well. So I think as a political journalist, I kind of expected basically politicians to tell me stuff. And it turns out that actually a lot of your job as a journalist is telling MPs a lot of stuff. Like you call them and you're like, what have you heard about this? And they're like, I've not heard anything. Can you tell me what you know? It's like for the love of God. But anyway, so, it turns out it kind of works in a way that I'd not quite expected, in which I think I'd not really seen from reading sort of like political coverage of Westminster, from reading books about it or anything. So the idea behind Haven't You Heard was to kind of try and bring this knowledge of kind of, I guess, the informal side of Westminster into broader public knowledge, especially at a time when clearly people care about politics. They hate most politicians and journalists, I think, but also don't necessarily understand everything that goes on. So I think having a greater level of kind of understanding of saying, look, this is how it works, and I'm not making a moral judgment in the book or a case for or against the way the bubble works, was kind of saying, look, this is kind of how it works. And also it's quite broken a lot of the time, and everyone's very neurotic and weird, but also they're just, at the end of the day, a group of people who just behave the way people do. And so there's only so much, I think, because there's occasionally conversations of how to change politics, how to professionalise politics, or make sure that the lobby... Oh, hello. How to make sure political journalism reflects the way politics was better, etc., etc. But I do think that at the end of the day, you can only change the way people do things and interact with each other to an extent. And, there's no sort of like great reforms I think you could kind of undertake to make politics sort of like very professionalised, and gossip wouldn't matter and who you are wouldn't matter at all, because at the end of the day, people are people. So I think that's kind of why I decided to write the book, but also because I was really tired of writing about Brexit day in, day out. And so I thought that if someone could give me money to do something else for 6 months, then I would. And it was a really enjoyable process, actually. And I was lucky enough to get to interview 84 people in the end. So anyone from peers and MPs, advisors, civil servants, quite a few people on this panel, actually. And it was really, really interesting. I feel like I learned a lot as well doing it. So I really hope you enjoy it.
So what was the most surprising thing? You've sort of started out, you've come in as a bit of a neophyte, Marie. You don't know very much what's going on. What really did you think? Emily Thornberry told us it's eye-popping, so give us something eye-popping.
Jesus Christ, I wrote the book ages ago. Can't remember what's in it.
It's here.
Can I just, that's a good question. But actually, one of the things, at least for me, was kind of the fact that so I just got surprised by my own mic there, was actually the fact that I think information flows in a way I'd kind of underestimated. So again, I kind of thought that I had, I guess, a sense of knowledge that obviously you were quite embedded within Westminster as a journalist, but I'd not quite realised how much you participate in the way sort of like gossip turns around, and the fact that, you'll hear something and then you'll talk to, let's say, taking the example of MPs, but annoyingly so in the book, if you read it, you'll see it was very annoying, to the example I use to try and explain how information sort of like travels around, even when it's not really something necessarily true about to happen, is the idea of a new centrist party, which at the time was kind of a running joke of something that would never happen. So I've had to add a lot of footnotes because obviously Change UK and the Independents, etc., ended up happening. So I think that for me, the biggest thing was actually the fact that as a journalist, you're definitely part of an item, and also as a wider thing, there is a sense that people tell you things for a reason, and you're kind of being used as a weapon in sort of like factional wars and wars between parties, etc., which I'd not quite realised beforehand, I guess.
Okay, let's just get some perspectives from our panel, and then we're going to have a bit of a chat, but also have your questions and comments, thoughts, and whatever. Where am I going to go? Matt, you've been on the inside in number 10. Were you there sort of trying to shut down gossip? We've heard about Dominic Cummings sort of hauling in SPADs and an incredibly well-reported meeting every Friday evening to issue them their orders and tell them not to leak anything so that he can leak it all unchallenged. Yeah. What strikes you about Westminster gossip and the bubble?
Well, I think, first of all, obviously everyone go and buy this book. I think Marie's perspective on this is always, both on Twitter and in her journalism, very, very fresh. I think there are two things that are really striking about the way the Whitehall Westminster bubble works, and I will come on to the question about number 10 and Dom Cummings, Jill. But weirdly, in a sense, it's like two-part, I think. Well, it's obviously many more than two-part, but two particular qualities that strike me are, one, the kind of strangely closed world of political journalism in SW1 and the lobby system. How that, Marie touched on it a little bit there, how that system of distributing information to in a closed order, basically, of journalists who have privileged access to number 10, in a sense privileged access to the Palace of Westminster, how that is, I think, fairly unique to most modern democracies in terms of how information is given to them and how they participate in the system. That creates gossip, it creates other dynamics, it helps to shape the way information gets out to the public, even with social media and even with 24-hour rolling news. And then there's a whole world in which the kind of lots of in-jokes, pop culture references, a slightly kind of British or English glibness kind of informs the way those interactions happen. So that's really interesting, I think, and distinctive. And I'm not saying that it's good, bad, or indifferent, but you can draw your conclusions about how it's played out in the Brexit thing. The second thing I think that's really interesting in terms of gossip, and I was one of the people who spoke to Marie, I think as a former civil servant by the time you, is the fact that while you have the political class, political journalists and politicians talking a lot among one another and talking indiscreetly occasionally. And the strange quality of this entire, I think, how many civil servants work in and around Whitehall? Tens of thousands, I presume. It's bizarre how little information, how little stuff actually leaks from civil servants. So I think one of the weirdly unique things about the UK is how unbelievably unleaky the civil service is. I think that's one of the things that for civil servants, whether you work in comms like I did, or whether you are, and as Jill did for a time, as well as policy, or you're a former statistician, as Jonathan Portis was, or whatever, it's actually surprising how little information gets out directly from civil servants doing their jobs to the media, despite the fact that they go to the same pubs, and Marie talks about them in her book. You know, loads of civil servants. Very
useful list of pubs.
Very useful list of pubs. If you're in the Red Lion or the Old Star or wherever, St Stephen's Tavern's obviously very touristy, but wherever it is, and there may be civil servants in the room tonight serving civil servants. It's a remarkable thing that so little information about the day job from working civil servants gets out, and I think that's remarkably underreported. And it's to come back to the point about, you know, the current number 10 and just the general sense that you know, people are going to be hung, drawn and quartered if they leak. Actually, generally, civil servants rarely do leak. I think that's a little bit to do with the, you know, the qualities that are drummed into civil servants and the sense of impartiality. But also, actually, there's very little career incentive for them to give something to a lobby journalist, whether it's for Politico Playbook or The Sun. Actually, their careers aren't structured in a way that if they're going to remain civil servants, that's particularly useful. So I think those are two things that are particularly distinctive about the UK system. One, the weirdness of the lobby and how that reinforces within the Palace of Westminster, but two, the oddness of the fact that there are tens of thousands of civil servants who are not leaking.
And what about number 10? Tell us about number 10.
Well, I think number 10 is a really strange. The number 10 operation is always odd in the sense that it is the only government department. I know it's technically not a freestanding government department, it's a part of the Cabinet Office, but it's basically its own department. It's the only place where you have anywhere close to parity between civil servants and special advisors. You're working in. When you're a civil servant in number 10, you are very close to politics. It's difficult not to, you're pretty near the knuckle. That's not to say you're doing party political stuff, but it's by definition harder to assert the line. You know, I did go through, in the previous regime, I went through a couple of leak inquiries, and it's not fun to have your phone seized and have cops interview you and have, you know, be told that you're, you know, had a couple of times for completely spurious things when it was fairly obvious that no civil servant had been involved in leaking, and so there's a kind of performative quality sometimes about you know, allegations about leaking and about, you know, certain people trying to assert authority and trying to look strong in kind of performative ways, and it's not always terribly helpful to the operation of government. But you know, the number 10 operation is maybe I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
We'll come back to it later on.
We'll come back to you. Maybe we'll come back to you after a few drinks outside.
Yeah.
Anyway, Tara, I'm quite interested in some of the stuff that Marie has in this, particularly her bits about Parliament, which suggests actually that some of the ways in which the sort of gossip and networking work in Parliament actually makes it quite a difficult environment for women, particularly younger women, to work. And I thought it was really quite an interesting sort of area that there are these networks, particularly the bars, where, you know, men would go and all things, but actually you didn't want to be seen there too much if you're a woman, and it was sort of a bit dodgy. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts about whether this, you know, something that trades so much on gossip networks and stuff like that actually is fundamentally a bit sexist.
Oh, it's majorly sexist. Like when you become a staffer for an MP, I've been there for about 3 years now, you do your security clearance, you get your pass, you're given an email, and you're kind of just like dropped in and you sink or you swim. And especially when you're a young woman, like there are books out there. I think there's one book, How to Be a Researcher and Work for MP. There are a few resources out there, but for the most part, working for a politician is learning on the job. So you then end up relying on the relationships you build. And so most of my closest confidants are, you know, women I've met in the toilets who need a little bit of like hype manning because they've had a tough day with their boss, or it's going to the strangers bar or sports and social, and someone coming up to me when I'm having a drink with someone, normally, you know, a man, and them saying, you probably shouldn't hang out with that guy, like he's a bit creepy, he's got a reputation, and then a friendship blossoms. because that person has actually saved me from a really creepy man who, without any, I wouldn't have known that, that person wasn't someone I should be spending time with. And then, you'll have people slide into your DMs on Twitter because they're trying to guess who you're subtweeting, and actually 9 times out of 10, they have got the person right because they recognize, the behaviors you're talking about. So you end up with this culture among staffers where a lot of our relationships are built on gossip, and not just, who's sleeping with who, or who's, done something weird in a meeting. It's also about protecting each other. And with the Me Too movement, when that hit Westminster, it only really came to light because of the gossip and because of the conversations that happened over coffees and, in the toilets and at bars between women, basically. And yeah, I don't know, we all love to gossip in Westminster, and especially as staffers, because it's such a thankless job, and it's enjoyable, but I think a lot of the time it is about, we are gossiping and sharing information with each other to, look out for one another, and that's why a group of us set up Women in Westminster a few months ago, because we realised there wasn't anything that connected, a young Labour staffer like me with young Tory women or young Lib Dems, and now I know all the gossip about Tory MPs because they tell me that, and they know all the Labour gossip, which is great fun. It's nice to not be gossiping about Labour all the time. But yeah, gossiping is a fundamental part of working in Parliament, and it is sexist as well, because you have to put yourself in situations like going to bars and, having coffees with people who you might not normally want to hang out with, just to be in the know, because the relationships you build it's not just for fun, it's also your political and your career capital. So, yeah.
And Duncan, just do you think it's actually good for government that there's this sort of, incestuous relationship, or Marie was telling us about this sort of two-way flow, bit of a dependency, politicians, a bit of a suggestion, I think, in Marie's book. I think she gives the example of Tessa Jowell, who sort of avoided criticism because everybody just thought she was basically very nice. Tessa Jowell was very nice. I don't want to say she's not very nice, but this sort of dependence between politicians and journalists, all sort of co-creating the product or whatever. We saw it maybe at its apogee with people like Alistair Campbell, McBride, and people like that. Dependency culture. I mean, is that actually a sort of joint conspiracy against the public and the public interest? Just to throw something in? Yeah, we can come in too.
I think what is striking is that, as Matthew said, there is this sort of chokehold on information that exists in the sort of Westminster Whitehall system that doesn't exist in other countries in Europe. So I used to be the Brussels correspondent for the Financial Times. And the metaphor I always use is like being in Brussels and journalists is like being in an orchard. There's just these big, juicy stories just lying on trees, and you just wander around and sort of pick them off. And it's fine, because like the French journalists aren't so interested in British stories because they're having a weird tomato row with Spain, and so you've sort of got it to yourself. And also there's so many different avenues from which you can get the story. You can try and speak to the Commission, then you can go around the individual member states, you can speak to random MEPs. So there's about 30 different ways you can stand up as a story. Whereas in Westminster, especially if you're in the lobby, you're very, very reliant on a very centralised body. And as Matthew said, Whitehall tends not to leak, which again, compared to the European Commission, is very, very different. So although it is quite incestuous, it's odd that more doesn't come out of it from that point of view. And you saw that during the Brexit negotiations. The British government genuinely believed it could sort of keep its hand like close to its chest, which you can't do when the other side is literally sharing every single bit of paper with 30 or 40 different people who just have a culture of dealing with journalists, of just being far more open. Like if you speak to Dutch or Scandinavian officials, they're sort of pathologically honest. And it's a very, very different attitude. They see themselves as sort of allies of journalists because they both obviously want to get to the truth. And so therefore, why wouldn't we work together? Or why wouldn't I help you get this document? And that attitude does not exist in the UK.
All right. I think it's just
Not so much.
pathologically secretive, maybe.
Yeah.
You see,
Whatever.
Whenever you go to, if you've ever been at a European Council, and obviously we have a big European Council coming up in just over a month's time. If you go into the big hall in the Justus Lipsius building, I'm sure Duncan spent many misspent hours
Many
there.
happy hours.
You'll see it during the European Council whenever they do lives, the TV do lives from the sort of platform and looking down on the press hall, which is connected to the big new building, the Europa building, where they do the actual meeting. Anyway, the individual country journalists will tend to sit on their own banks of desks, and the Brits will all sit on one desk, and the kind of number 10 approach is generally to go and brief the Brits in a slightly more, and that's, by the way, long predates Brexit. It's not particularly a kind of like a reflection on Brexit or even the current administration, who actually haven't had a European Council yet. But there's this kind of number 10 goes down and you brief the lobby who have travelled, usually the travelling lobby who are there rather than the Brussels correspondents. And then what tends to happen is the Dutch journalists or the Maltese journalists or the Irish journalists will kind of they'll sort of wander over and kind of listen to that. And there's much more. The rest of the thing is just so much more open, and information is just sort of parried around. Whereas there's a much more quality here of it being like, gather round, you're in the secret circle. I'm going to tell you something.
Marie, you wanted to come in on incestuous relationships.
Well, I did know because I think. Cool, yeah. No, so I guess what I want to say is to come back to your original question, and it's all. I mean, that bit is all in the book. But I think what I find really interesting is when people say, and obviously journalists are too close to politicians, and that's why they may not write certain stories. We did a Tessa Gel example in the book was from talking to multiple lobby journalists who were kind of around at the time. And I think it's not just that from the outside it's quite easy to see it as straightforward. Well, MP X is my friend. Therefore, if he's done something bad, I may not write about it. But I don't, and I'm sure that may happen, but I think it's a bit more complicated than that a lot of the time. So the example one journalist gave, actually, and I normally can't remember the name of the MP, the Tory minister who was caught sexting women last year.
Brooks, whatever.
Andrew Griffiths.
Oh,
so remember, yeah.
Oh, right.
But anyway, so it's kind of like, that was...
How many were there?
It was around the time of that story. So it's kind of obviously like coloring the conversation and talking to this lobby journalist who said, it's not, what we mostly learned from that is that no one seems to like him very much because, everyone kind of piled in, no one tried to explain what was going on. Obviously the story was slightly weird because we never got the woman's side of the story, like the woman's side of the text, etc. And, that journalist was like, it's actually, the problem is not, what we decide to write or decide not to write, but it's also how we feel about someone. So I think the example he gave was Tom Tugendhat said, let's say Tom Tugendhat, all the journalists basically like him because he's good fun and, likes talking to us and is interesting. If he were to do something bad, would we not have a moan saying, oh, but, try to be understanding the same way that you would be of a friend saying, oh, but, maybe he's going through a rough patch or maybe, maybe there's a reason why he did that or something. So I think, the same way I think in any friendship or any professional relationship, if you like someone, you're a lot more likely to make excuses for them or maybe say, oh, actually that bad thing they did, was it really so bad? Was it such a massive thing? So I think it's not all kind of conspiracy level, I like eggs, therefore I'm not going to write about them. I think that it's also part of you excuse people more readily.
Politicians suffer if, one of the comments people used to make about Theresa May, who used to be Prime Minister, if you can remember, back to 7 weeks ago, was that she actually wasn't very good at, she wasn't very clubbable, I suppose is the word. You've got a bit about, it's sort of quite male, it's quite public school, it's easier to sort of create a network if you've already come in with the one that you were basically launched into at age 5 in your prep school or whatever, that she didn't have that sort of thing, that she probably didn't hang out with journalists and do that sort of just chatting and chewing the fat a bit and stuff. Is that an essential skill to be basically a politician? Can you really, really succeed today if you're actually a politician who really just doesn't like gossiping with other people?
I think both, Theresa May did manage to become Prime Minister, so I think it can work to an extent. And Jeremy Corbyn, I guess, has a similar sort of non-existing relationship with journalists. So I think you can certainly rise through the ranks as an MP, I think, if you don't necessarily really like gossip and kind of those fun, informal, interpersonal relationships, where it's kind of like playing politics on hard mode. So, and the same way would be, I think, for a journalist, if you can either sort of, go drinking quite a lot, get to know lots of people, so you can, text people if you hear something. Or you can, I guess, you can probably fire off like 1,000 FOIs and read every white and green paper and whatever. And, both bits would probably get the same amount of stories, but one is a lot more work, which is why I personally do the former. But on a more serious note, I think it is definitely possible. And as we're kind of, seeing with Boris at the moment, the fact that both he and Carrie are quite close to journalists, that's not going to save them at this stage. I'm not sure anything can. So I think it definitely helps. But no, actually, the way, one, and annoyingly that could make it into the book, because I just had too many great quotes. But so this former SPAD explained it that way. She was like, gossip is a great thing to use occasionally, on top of everything else. If you've got, several sort of weapons at your disposal, obviously gossip should be one of them. But she was like, no, basically, if you just use gossip, it's just basically using a segue. And it's thing if you think you're going quite fast and everyone thinks you're looking like a moron because they can see what you're doing, and you will fall off a cliff.
Okay, let's have some comments and questions. We've got to speak from the audience. We have some roving mics. We have Maddie and Aaron who will take questions. If anyone's next door wants to duck in their head in or whatever, let's go. I'll take them in batches. There are lots of questions. Let's go. Aaron, no.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Sabine Arnaud, French journalist. So I've been journalist in Brussels, in Berlin, and in Paris. So what you describe from Brussels is very unique, and what you describe about London is very similar to Paris and Berlin, because it's human being, I think, maybe with some specific things like your parliament being so small that no foreign journalist can get in. And I think one of the aspects I would ask you about is more respect of private life. Yeah. That's because we have red lines that are not supposed to be the same ones as a British journalist.
I find that...
Yeah.
Sorry, I was
Great.
just like, a topic I feel strongly about.
It's your event.
No, I find that super interesting. I'm French as well and grew up in France and everything. So I find it very, very weird, the amount of stories people sort of get away with here. But also I think, it's a difference. I think there's a belief of saying that if you're in public life, everything's basically fair game. But also I think it's quite linked to the tabloid culture thing of kind of saying, if you're in public life, if you do anything that's kind of untowards and, in non-family, sort of man-like, then you deserve to be outed so the voters, can know what you're like. But I think more fundamentally, it's kind of a difference, a quite fundamental difference in how the British press and the French press see themselves and see their purpose in life. So I think that in France, especially kind of looking at it, French journalists do tend to be quite worthy and I think there is a sense of, we're here to chronicle history and chronicle what happens. Whereas I think that in Britain, especially tabloids, there's a sense of, they're just kind of doing it to have fun. Especially, the Sun is just here to have a good time. Basically, and several Sun journalists I interviewed basically agreed with that, and so obviously I'm kind of trying to shoehorn one of my favourite anecdotes, which is from the Sun actually, because I was trying to there's a bit in the book where I try to explain public interest and the fact that actually a lot of British journalists effectively, can bend the rules of what is in the public interest and what isn't. If there's something they really want to publish, they will find some way to say, but actually, this is why it was in the public interest. And my absolute favourite example was so Simon Danczak, the former MP, was sleeping with this woman who was 19 or 20 or whatever, and the Sun did a big story on it. But actually, if you looked at it quite closely, he was single because he'd separated from his partner. It was a consensual relationship. The woman was not underage or anything, so there was nothing there for it to be in the public interest. But they apparently once had sex in his constituency office, which is paid for by the taxpayer. And taxpayers deserve to know how their money is spent, which is just brilliant. It's brilliant. And you can tell that whoever came up with that in the newsroom was really happy and really just well, there you go. There's that, or security risk is always a good favourite of publishing. So if anyone, I think it was when Dominic Raab's advisor was a sugar baby, I think, on the side. By the way, in the book there is a footnote explaining what a sugar baby is, which I think is a first for a book about politics. I'm very happy with that. You know, so it was kind of, you know, selling effectively sexual services on the side. And I can't remember which paper did it first, but basically their thing was like, well, you know, it is a potential national security risk if someone were to blackmail her. And it's like, bollocks. You just wanted to print that because it was a story about sex and politics. So I think that basically British journalists are more open to the idea of just kind of having fun and being, you know, gotcha is the gotcha culture, which I think France definitely doesn't have and other countries don't really have either, or not to the same extent.
So Tara, do you see part of your role as sort of promoting the sort of, you know, public image of your, making them sort of interesting, or have you had to sort of, you know, ward off, you know, unpleasant stories that journalists are saying are in the public interest, or not yet?
I'm lucky enough to have not had to do that, but many of my friends have who work for MPs. There is a lot of, I think it's hard because I think a lot of people get into politics and work for politicians because they've got really strong political views and they, you know, want to stand up for what they think is right. And I think sometimes we find it difficult when our politician who we believe in, we have breakfast, lunch and sometimes dinner with, we are with all the time, we're texting, we're calling, you know, we're their best friend, we're absolutely everything to them. When they do something we disagree with, politically it's like, okay, sure, that's fine, I can forgive it, I'll forgive you. But when it's something that you morally disagree with, staffers do find that really tough. And I know many staffers or former staffers who have left their jobs because actually they can't stand up and, you know, hide a MP's affair or, you know, harassment or bullying.
And Duncan, I mean, is Brussels, as you said you worked in Brussels, are all these high-minded journalists in Brussels, they're not interested? I mean, we get a bit about Jean-Claude Juncker and how drunk is he or whatever, but basically is there sort of zero interest among the continental journalists in the personal life?
With the Juncker thing, it was the British tabloids who really went for that story to the point where it sort of slightly poisoned the relationship there. There's lots of salacious gossip that goes on, but as far as I can tell, not as much of it ends up going anywhere. And I think also it's just the levels of interest is slightly lower. So MEP, particularly in Britain, but lots of countries in Eastern Europe as well, lots of people can't really name their MEPs and things like that. So if I came across some salacious thing involving some MP, like, most people haven't heard of most MPs, and even few have heard of MEPs, so there wasn't just the sort of demand for it either.
So the more interesting is sort of expenses and stuff like that, I suppose, which is things. I mean, actually, Marie, on expenses, you've got a sort of thing where I'm told by my very excellent assistant that you've got an example, Chris Bryant, saying that the expenses scandal was sort of really a gossip story, but was sort of masked as a public interest story. Yeah.
Yes, no, that was really interesting actually, because I interviewed, I think it's Chris Bryant and Greg Hands as well, so both MPs I interviewed, and they brought up the expenses scandal unprompted as an example of basically like gossip and kind of like basically political journalism being gossip, which I thought was really interesting because I'd never really seen it as that. And I did put it to one of the journalists who worked on the expenses scandal, who was not thrilled with their kind of view of the scandal. But I actually think, talking to other people and kind of having a think about it, they did have a point in the sense that if you were to, I think, come through and look through, like every MP, what they did, you know, what expenses they fiddled, etc., and what punishment they got for it, there was no proper reasoning. It was very much a case of actually, you know, who's popular, who's in with the leadership team at that point, who's got stuff probably coming out on them anyway, or, you know, or even actually, because I can't remember who made that argument, but saying that, you know, some people actually flipped their houses, etc., or like did some really dodgy stuff with expenses, but it was really boring, so they got away with it. It was just something where, you know, you actually kind of had to know what you were talking
about.
Duck
house is much more interesting.
You know, exactly, and Duck Pond guy, who forgets Duck, who can forget Duck Pond guy, or I can't remember who bought a pink laptop, I think, and I was hearing was that a man buying a pink laptop, and, you know, and people remembered that. So I think in that sense, I think the argument Chris and Greg were trying to make was that actually it was gossip because it was about personal, you know, the personal.
Oh, Becky Smith having to resign because her husband.
No, exactly, and so it was, you know, it was very much the personal and actually the kind of, it was titillating. It was covered in a titillating way.
It's a risk of being a politician in Britain. Aaron Jonathan here, and
Hi, I'm Jonathan Portis from King's. Question, you know, how does this matter in a sense? Sorry, I'm not meaning to denigrate the lives of everybody in this room who's part of the bubble, but People gossip, and it's fun, and it's fun to read about, but how does this actually affect outcomes? And I mean, the most obvious way, for those of us who've both been in the Whitehall policy world and now are in the sort of analysis commenting world and are spoken to by journalists, the most, the sort of frustration we get, I think both of those groups that I have belonged to, is when, from our perspective, it looks like the gossip is driving out the analysis in the way that it's presented to the public. And it's really quite noticeable, no offense to any political correspondents here, when a story switches from being the preserve of the health correspondent or the biotech correspondent who generally knows what they're talking about to being a political argument, and then you get, no offense to Laura Koonsberg, but you get it presented as basically not quite gossip, but it is basically gossip. It's a story about who wants what, who's maneuvering what, and so on. And I guess the question is that inevitable? Is it damaging? Is it what people want? Is there a better way of doing it? I don't know the answers to any of those questions.
Matt, would we be better government without the lobby, I think? So if newspapers are all sort of very worthy, full of very well informed, especially basically just the FT, which would make sort of Treasury officials, people like that, very happy, and nothing was refracted through the who's up, who's down, what's this doing in terms of manoeuvring, Tim Shipman didn't exist, whatever. So would we be better government if we had that? We'll get on to you in a second. Anyway, Matt.
I think it's a really good question, and I think it's, I don't know the answer, but this is hedging my bets answer. I don't know the answer, but I think it's really worth discussing. And I think Jonathan's question is actually a really, it's a legitimate one in the sense I think actually gossip is really important and I think in terms of understanding how outcomes happen. Like, look, the UK is doing the most momentous thing it has done in peacetime or in any of our lifetime. Well, not in any of our lifetimes, obviously. I don't know if some people were here during the Second World War. But
I'm not that old.
Anyway. No, obviously not. Sure. Since the Second World, it's the most momentous thing.
Right, okay.
It's the most momentous thing that's happened since the Second World War. Given that information has been, how we analyse and interpret information has been completely critical to Brexit, because Brexit was, first of all, a campaign. It was a campaign about how people interpreted information and received, sorry to get very kind of like pseudo-academic, it is completely important, it's completely critical to understand how information is distributed within Westminster, among people who are in the priestly tribe of civil servants, politicians and journalists who communicate about policy and politics to the rest of the civilization. So it's really, really important. Now, to get onto the specific meat of the question, I think it would be better if policy and information was, government policy and politics was communicated in a slightly more open way. I think gossip is vital, critical, inherent to politics everywhere, clearly, and it's part of the tradecraft of politics, whether lobby briefings and journalist briefings are on camera or not. That being said, I think the UK probably does suffer from a slightly medieval, unwritten kind of way of communicating information to journalists, and the UK has lots of amazing political journalists, and I think, so that's not really about the individual quality of the media. I think there is a structural question, though, about how information gets out of Westminster to the rest of the public. For example, to give an example, actually, sort of touches on what Jonathan asked there. There is this is more about how media interact with government, but the lobby tend to dominate how policy is communicated to the outside world. I don't know because I left government a year or two ago, but it's obviously still the Department of Health interact with health correspondents and national newspapers and broadcasters, and the Education Department and the Home Office and Justice to the Home Affairs people. So that still happens. But if there's a big political story, if there's a big announcement about something, it is more often than not, if it comes from number 10, it'll go to the lobby, and so it'll be framed and refracted through that lens. That's not directly about gossip, but it is I think there is an important question about how stuff is framed and discussed. I haven't answered that question exactly as I would have liked, but the answer is yes, it's really important. I think we need to keep debating it, particularly post-Brexit.
So Marie, is the lobby a force for...
I wrote a piece last year calling for the abolition of the lobby, so I think I'm quite straightforward on that. I'm not sure, I mean, that piece was quite fun to write, but I do think one of the problems, I do kind of agree with you, I think one of the problems is that, broadly speaking, the media has no money anymore. So I think in an ideal world, you would have kind of correspondents with a policy area each, or at least covering 2 or 3 policy areas each. But the fact is that there's no money in newspapers anymore. And actually, what does happen is that that there'll be, I don't know, some scandal at education or whatever, and suddenly every lobby journalist is like, hello, I'm an education specialist now, so this cool funding thing, and then and it becomes much easier to spin stuff to them because obviously they have no idea, and that's part of the reason why I just do features in my corner now, because I can't really do this. I can't really pretend to be like, oh yes, defence. I know things about weapons. I can name several, no, so I think, it's basically, on quite a basic thing, a media funding problem. It's also a wider media thing. And politics is not the only area where that happens, but the public doesn't read serious political stories about policy. And we didn't know that until quite recently, because people just bought an entire paper. And now we know exactly which bit of the papers they read, and it's not that. And I've seen that because I have done it when I was, working at BuzzFeed, and the amount of stuff I wrote, which I thought was quite interesting and incisive, and actually about policy work, etc. No one read it. No one. And the media can't really justify that. So I think it is partly the fault of the public.
Okay, public, if you're watching, it's it's your fault. Tara, do you have much to do with the lobby where you are in?
My mic, everyone, don't worry. Nothing to be alarmed about. It's not a female police constable.
All right, okay. That was, if you weren't watching Boris Johnson's speech earlier, that was an obscure reference from that. Do you have much to do with the lobby? It's sort of, or do you steer well clear?
Most staffers do, if you work in Parliament. I mean, some do, some don't. But a lot of the job of being a parliamentary staffer is, putting out press releases, or speaking to the lobby, speaking to people like Duncan about what our MP thinks or is going to do. But it is a constant complaint I hear from MPs that the lobby just operates as like one bubble. And you do kind of see it when, no offense again, like when you go on Twitter and something comes out, like Laura Kay tweets it, and then every single person is like tweeting it after that. And when MPs log on and see that, they're like, the lobby's just the same. The lobby can't work with the lobby. And so there is this weird kind of, rift, I think, between politicians and the lobby, and us staffers kind of get stuck in the middle.
So no one, of course, could make Jonathan's accusation against the Economist.
Yes, we're very, very serious. Part of the problem is that political correspondents are very, very sort of defensive of their patch. Like, I think it could be easily solved by just allowing, when those big stories in a certain policy area do break, just allowing correspondents into the lobby to try and pin down Downing Street on certain topics. I think that would be quite an easy thing to do. But the other thing is that there could just be a culture shift in Whitehall of being more open with journalists. Like, the Economists are lucky now. We still have sectoral specialists. We've got a health person. We've got a crime person. We've still got those specialists. But it is like getting blood from a stone sometimes. Like, they're extremely defensive. Maybe because they're sort of like once bitten, twice shy, because they've had this non-expert come in and just trample everywhere. But I think there does need to be a mentality shift.
But whose interest it's in? I mean, frankly, if I'm a minister doing... Maybe the public, but if I'm sitting over there, it's hugely easier to feed some lines to some lobby journalist who's just going to sort of take it, rather than say, oh, 14 billion for education. Well, that only looks like 3 billion a year to me, because you've added up quite a lot of years, and actually if you'd added up quite a lot more years, you'd have got an even bigger number. I mean, it's much easier just to feed these top lines to slightly undercritical political correspondence, isn't it?
I don't doubt it's in the politicians' interest to have that, but I think that is it necessarily in Whitehall's interest to sort of have these big numbers spun out, and then voters along the line sort of thinking, oh, why isn't my school better? It's like, oh, because the money didn't actually exist, because it was just rebadged from something else.
Right. Interesting. Let's go to the back there, Maddie, Daniel, and then we'll come here. Yeah.
Daniel Thornton from ARC. I think sociologists say that gossip can help enforce social norms at the risk of getting a bit academic. I think, Tara, what you were saying sort of touched on that with Me Too and the reporting of harassment and bullying in the Commons. I don't know if the other panellists see that in the gossip that they participate in. Is it about norms or is it about other stuff?
Marie?
I do actually sort of have a ready-made answer for that, which is that I sort of have a slightly bold thesis in one of the chapters, which is that Guido Fawkes has had a positive influence on Westminster. But, you know, which I'm not entirely sure is true, but I guess my thinking, and in talking to people who have worked for Guido Fawkes and for other people, it is the case of, you know, what Guido did is that they came in and they said, you know, there is no story too small for us, there's nowhere to hide for you, because as a, let's say, staffer, junior journalist, whatever, you would normally think, well, no one knows who I am, it's not in the public interest to write anything about me if I get too drunk or whatever. Whereas Guido sort of came in and said, you know, like, everyone's fair game, everything's fair game, because as long as we get clicks from within SW1, then, you know, it's fine for us. Rightly or wrongly, but I do think that there was a slight sort of like panopticon effect that kind of took an after a while, because basically people said, oh, actually, you know, I could get written about, and some people did get written about, most of them kind of unfairly. And actually interviewing someone who used to work for Guido, they said that one story they used to always do was shame MPs who would claim expenses, very, very small things. So, you know, the kind of like 1 carton of juice for 67 pence, they put that under expenses, etc. And he was saying, actually, you know, since we started doing that and we kept doing it for a while, and after a while, MPs just stopped doing it because they clearly knew they were about to get shamed, and they kind of stopped submitting those tiny expenses. So I think in a weird way, and I think Guido, this is not to say Guido is good in any way, I just think it's had an inadvertent positive impact on Westminster, because again, I think social norms have been affected by it because people can't quite behave in the way that they thought they could.
Tara, I'm quite interested in you. You were talking about earlier about Me Too affecting Westminster. One of my colleagues, Hannah White's been doing a lot on sort of bullying in Parliament, particularly of, you know, both Commons and Lord staff, but also researchers have difficulty it is to do it. Do you get the sense that actually has behaviour improved since you know, it became more acceptable to sort of be calling people out on these sorts of things?
In all honesty, no.
No.
Because politicians still aren't really held to account for their behaviour. And I think when the Me Too movement hit Westminster in winter, like 3 years ago, there was definitely a sense of hope among staffers. We kind of thought, great, you know, like, here's our chance to shape Westminster, you know, make politicians accountable for their behaviour, and not just politicians, but anyone in Westminster who behaves inappropriately. And so a lot of us were quite riled up and excited. And then nothing happened. And you know, there would be big stories in the news, but then you'd see people back in the cabinet, you'd see them walking around, they've still got parliamentary passes, they're still MPs, they're still journalists. And now, like, you know, when I speak to other women and other people in Parliament, I don't think there's anyone who really feels like things have changed. I think like MPs and whoever else in Westminster will make jokes about how, oh, you know, I can't go for coffee with you by myself in case I get called a sex pest, and like people make jokes about Me Too more often than they take it seriously. So. Yeah.
Isn't that the thing as well? I think what was really symptomatic of actually the kind of darker side of Westminster's obsession with gossip was when I feel like we were, yeah, as you said, we were making some progress, you know, some people were being named, and, you know, we're talking about, you know, kind of big wall changes, everything. And then there was, there's a spreadsheet with names, you know, that came out, and suddenly everyone became obsessed with that. And actually I thought the spreadsheet was really weird, because you'd have, like, reading it, you'd kind of get whiplash, because that one line would be, oh, you know, an MP who was single was going out with another MP who was also single, and then go from that to an MP forced like an underage girl to have an abortion, and it was so you know, the spreadsheet was kind of very, very weird, and everyone just went into that and said, you know, who really wrote the spreadsheet? Is that stuff true? Is X MP actually gay? Whatever. And then, you know, and then we sort of did that for 3 weeks, and then Me Too disappeared, and I think, you know, and I'm sure you could as well, but like the amount of MPs I could name, where I thought, finally that person will get named, will start behaving the way they do. And then no, it didn't happen because we just moved on. Because it was just the spreadsheet. So I think it is, and that nearly comes back to your question, Jonathan, in a weird way, of occasionally the kind of temptation to just lean on the funny gossip side kills potential serious conversations.
Duncan, I'm quite interested in how Daniel was asking about social norming, how the fact that you sort of instantly get every political correspondent reacting. If you watch Prime Minister's Question, I don't bother to watch Prime Minister's Question, but I do watch Twitter on Prime Minister's Questions to know, because I can't bear watching it, but I do like watching the reviews come in. And then, you get people sort of pouring out their views, but they're quite similar assessments from, obviously there's a bit of political things. Kevin Maguire's probably going to say something slightly different to Harry Cole or Tom Newton-Dunn or whatever. But, is there a tendency that political correspondents come sort of too instantly to a similar judgment about, was that a success, was it not, and stuff, because they just so obviously see everybody else in real time making their judgments?
No, it is striking, and that does happen. And the thing about Twitter is that you just see what was happening before in private, just in real time, which I suppose is a more honest and open way of doing it. It is peculiar though, and it does feel just maybe slightly sociological, because I have a lobby pass. I'm technically in the lobby, but I don't have an office in Parliament, and the offices are just in one big corridor, and they're sort of next door to each other. And the people refer to sort of colleagues who work rather than sort of rivals who work for other newspapers. And so it is just almost a natural tendency that if you do just spend all day, every day with the same group of people, you might end up thinking the same as them.
Mass groupthink.
Yeah, that's definitely true. It has I don't know if it was clearly not unique. The White House people sit in the same press pulpit. It's tend to form judgments in a kind of herd rather than.
Yes.
Dave Neat, a lawyer and poet. Gossip, as it relates to individuals, have a negative connotation, and in the past, it has brought down politicians, lots of politicians. But maybe in the past, people would seek to suppress gossip to, maintain their political futures. Now, in the recent past, we've seen personalities rise to the highest office of power, and those personalities, both in US and UK, have been the most talked about, and the chatter about them hasn't necessarily been good. It's good and bad, I suppose, but it's just they get the most volume of gossip about them. So do you think we're now in an era where gossip is now more a force that encourages sort of personalities who are most talked about to actually rise up the political scale? And do you come across people who maybe even actually encourage gossip about themselves, good or bad, to increase their profile?
I think that's a really interesting question, because I think the interesting question about, is being talked about just, is all publicity good publicity? If you're a politician, that sort of, gets you name recognition, always sort of interesting if you, how few politicians actually have any name recognition. Clearly, our current Prime Minister scores very high on that. But I'm also quite interested about the sort of extent to which the sort of fact that, details of your personal life or whatever can be part of the sort of currency deters. I think Isabel Hardman wrote a book about why we don't get very good politicians, and people who are deterred perhaps from living in this sort of bubbly life and exposing whatever. So just sort of quite interested as we sort of finish up. Let's go down the panel and give Marie the last word. Is gossip, if you're a politician, is it force for good or bad? Better to be talked about or not talked about? And is it more generally in the public interest, a force for good or bad? Matt?
I would say the answer is the answer to the second part is it depends what the outcome is. If it's kind of like just normal tradecraft of people gossiping who work in politics, that's fine, and that's a kind of completely necessary way that people in all bits of Whitehall and Westminster will and have done that since time immemorial. But the answer to the first part is, I think, really important, as well as the other stuff we've talked about how information gets out to the public, and is the lobby system the right one, and what implication does that have for example, as Tara's been talking about, people who work in Parliament, researchers. But the specific question about does it deter people, weirdly, I think it probably does. Actually, I think that's a really acute question you've asked. Like at the minute there, it's clear that the norms have shifted, possibly without us knowing it, where you have a very particular kind of prime minister and a very particular kind of president in the US who are performative about, in a sense, their strangeness and their uniqueness in a way that is like, breaks a lot of the rules about political communication and about presentation that we've taken for granted.
And about personal standards.
And about personal standards, and about people's both their personal lives, their personal appearance. Using personal appearance as a sort of tool of distinction and carving out an image for that, based on that, and kind of wearing it in plain sight. Really, that the fact that you're different and distinct, and that you're holding yourself to different standards, I think probably does deter people who are not just more reserved. I mean, we've probably had the most reserved prime ministers of all time, who's just left off, possibly just reserved to a fault, I would probably argue. But in general, I think people who have perhaps a slightly more well-balanced relationship with themselves as a performer. All politicians are and have to be performers because they talk for a living. But people who have a slightly more well-balanced relationship between themselves as performers, as public entities, their families, their friends, even just their desire to be in pubs in Westminster, or Strangers Bar, or IFG drinks receptions with the best will in the world every night of the week, rather than just at home with their families or in the pub with their other mates who aren't working in politics. I think it probably does change the calculation and change the standards for people who, as Isabel Harbinger in her book, who might otherwise be interested in getting involved in politics because they're passionate about education, they're passionate about whatever.
Tara, force for good, force for bad.
I think it depends on who you are. Like, if you look at how Boris Johnson has, succeeded despite all the gossip and, some really serious allegations about him. But then you look at how Diane Abbott was treated when she made a mistake counting something on TV 2 years ago, and I, still when I see, family and friends and people in Westminster, they still bring that up. Yet someone like Boris, a posh white guy who went to Eton, he gets away with it. So I think some people are excused, and some people benefit from the gossip culture a lot more than others. And yeah, if you are not to sound like the cliche feminist here, but if you are a straight white guy who is very privileged, you are going to benefit from people talking about you a lot more than a black working class woman is.
Duncan?
Whether it's good or bad, I think it can be fine as part of a healthy overall information diet.
In moderation?
In moderation. The example I was thinking of today involved Boris Johnson and his brother coming out and saying this man is not fit to be Prime Minister. So I've spent this week sort of writing a piece
He
about
didn't quite say that.
It said it wasn't in the national interest. It's getting there. It's not a very brotherly thing to say. And so I was thinking, I wrote a piece about the Tory party and their prospects with their sort of authoritarian turn and giving speeches in front of a policeman. And part of me thought, would I have been better off just finding out as much gossip as I possibly could and saying there's a big bust-up coming in the Johnson family? Would my readers have been more informed? And from some point of view, yes, because I think that's going to play a huge role in any election. That's going to be on every single poster across the country. Like, his brother won't vote for him, why would you? And so I think you've got to have a little bit of both, but not too much.
There is something really important there about that, and it's a really boring, not to bring it back to the tedious subject that we spent the last 3 years talking about. But as Duncan was saying, maybe, and I was in number 10 at the time, sort of in retrospect, maybe in about kind of February 2016, whenever David Cameron was doing his, came back with his deal from Donald Tusk. If people, if the media in Westminster was paying slightly more attention to well, will John Whittingdale be coming out for no, or will John Whittingdale lose the whip, and who's up and who's down, who's going to be? If there's slightly more attention paid to, for example, the UK's trade relationship with the European Union post exit, then who knows, the public may have had slightly more roughage in their information diet.
So we'd reported Brexit as a sort of issue about the long-term economic and political future of the UK rather than a Tory psychodrama.
I think that's possible, yes, Jill. I think you may put it slightly more succinctly than I did, yes.
Marie, last word. Gossip. Good, bad, essential, avoidable?
Can I just say read the book to find out?
Read the book to find out.
No, I am actually going to say, no, sorry, I was joking. But I'm not, so I think obviously it's a bit more complicated than that, but like, I think gossip is needed in Westminster because you find kind of time and time again that informal networks, informal sharing of information normally happens when formal channels fail. And that's kind of how people end up being able to do their job. But the word of caution, I guess I have, which is basically the conclusion of the book, is that social media and kind of internet in general has kind of changed the way information travels in Westminster, how much gets leaked, how much gets out. And on top of that, you do kind of have the hyper-polarization of the political scene in the UK at the moment, and so there's less of the kind of sharing of gossip for gossip's sake, but everything becomes partisan, everything becomes an attack or proof that the other side really is evil, etc., which I do think is an issue because, again, I think at quite a fundamental level, Westminster does need gossip to properly function, and so if we lose that, things I do think will get worse.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to our panel. Reminder to read the book. It is available outside to buy. Marie is, I think, prepared to sign it, so you have your personalised copy if you want to get it outside. Do join us for drinks, because one of the things that the book makes very clear is that one of the keys to getting on here is informal networking over drinks in Westminster, and the huge big benefit of here over the Clarence, the Red Lion, whatever it is, at the Institute for Government, the drinks are free. So would you please thank our fantastic panel? And go and let the essential oil of Whitehall and Westminster flow freely next door. Thank you very much. Thank you, Marie.